Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast.
The podcast that hopes to bring a national discussion on the differing intersections of the fight to end gun violence. This is your host, Elijah Nichols.
And Addison Moore.
From DC.
Welcome to Root Causes.
Today we will be discussing voter suppression and how gun violence is political with Henry Hicks and Monét Ballard.
Welcome, Henry and Monet. How are you all doing today?
Good. How are y'all today?
Good.
I'm vibing, among a pandemic, it's a vibe sometimes, but just sit back and relax.
Right. So why don't you two go ahead and introduce yourselves and give the audience an idea of who you all are?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say a quick thank you to Elijah and Addison for inviting me to be here today. But, like was said, my name is Henry Hicks. I am from Nashville, Tennessee, though I'm currently a senior at Oberlin College up in Ohio, where I'm working as our chair of Student Senate. But aside from that, I have done a little bit of work in a few congressional offices for Congressman Jim Cooper from Tennessee and Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, and spent a few months this year working in Waterloo, Iowa, as a field organizer on the Kamala Harris for the People campaign.
I'm Monét Ballard. I'm a senior at George Mason University. I'm originally from Suffolk, Virginia. Right now, I'm a organizing fellow at New Virginia Majority, a nonprofit organization that advocates for women, immigrants, people of color, and working class people in Virginia. I'm really passionate about helping those who do not typically have a voice in our country and finding ways through our complex system to empower and fight for them. I do on the ground work, and I also do it through social media. But yeah, that's me.
Yeah, awesome. So let's dive right into the conversation. I want to hear from both of you in your experiences, whether it's campaign work, whether it's voter engagement work. How do you identify? How do you understand what is voter suppression, and who do you see that is most impacted by voter suppression?
Again, the organization I worked for, we did a lot of going out, get out to vote type of things and registering people. From my understanding, voter suppression is a way to lower votes and suppress those people who are going out to vote and basically having their voices ignored. But from what I've done, I would go out to communities who would typically not be able to get registered or go out to vote and make sure they would get registered, and to also let them know what's going on and where they can go vote if they needed help going there.
And I think I would just kind of add on to that. I think that one of the things that's really important is to mention is that voter suppression is ever evolving. So I think the way that we see voter suppression today, it might be photo ID laws, cuts to early voting, felony disenfranchisement. And so the ways that voter suppression manifests is ever evolving, but who it impacts is going to stay the same, and that's going to be intentional. I'd say in my experience, similar to Monet, when I was spending time in Waterloo the past few months, I really saw voter suppression on full display. I would go and I would knock on people's doors, and the thing that I would hear most often is caucusing is not accessible to me. I work nights, I can't go caucus at my caucus location. I have children, I can't afford childcare. I am not able-bodied, so I can't go stand in a room for 2 hours. Or felony disenfranchisement, all of these different things, I think intentionally impact specific communities, but the ways that voter suppression manifests is something that's ever changing.
Absolutely. And something that is interesting, Waterloo is in Iowa, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So when I was doing a little research on voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement, Iowa came up a lot, specifically because they have legislation on the books that permanently discriminate against those that have prior convictions. And something that was quite interesting and horrifying with the way that Iowa's police state is set up and how it disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities. Nearly 1 in 4 voting age Black men cannot register to vote in Iowa, which is actually insane. And it's disgusting, frankly.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I would go and I would knock on people's doors, and, every single day, I would have people come to their door, they would say, I am really, really passionate about the issues that are impacting my community, and I really do want to get involved, but I can't vote. I can't participate. That's something that I think is really true in Tennessee. I mean, Tennessee has awful numbers in the same way as Iowa. And so that's an issue that I think it impacts people across the country. In the 2016 election, I mean, that's something that really seriously prevented people from being able to vote. And I think, we look at these communities and, we sometimes say, you need to make sure that you're out there voting, being present on election day, but we're not considering the fact that these are people that are systematically prevented from having that access to the ballot.
I think another thing too, as organizers, we could help find those communities who are heavily impacted. So those who have felonies. So what I've done, I've been able to help restore rights to those who've been convicted before, to let them be able to vote again. And a couple people in my organization that I work for have done that too. And it's truly amazing seeing these people who thought they would never be able to participate and have their voice heard again, be able to vote, and into tears almost. Actually, a lot of times people would cry over these type of things. And it's really moving seeing that they can actually go out and help others. There's a couple people I know as well who have had their rights restored and helped other people who are trying to restore their rights go out and motivate others. So that's another big thing that needs to be worked on within our communities. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, we need that community support. We need all of us there helping one another in the ways that we can to restore voting rights within our small circles and the larger systems that we have as well. Whether it's, if you can, like lobbying for a certain piece of legislation, calling your legislators about removing voter ID laws from the book, or voter ID laws, polling locations, things like this, ensuring that we have accessibility to the polls and to registration up front is super, super important. Any way that anyone can help, we should be trying our best to. Absolutely.
And I think it's also something that you brought up, Monét, was that, the fact that these folks who haven't been able to vote, having their rights restored and like coming to tears, it just shows that like voting for some folks, it's like, it's really impactful. And I think it also humanizes people. I think being able to participate in that way in the country that you live in can be really impactful to how you feel. And I think that, knowing for some folks that it is really a privilege to be able to vote and not worry about your voice not being heard in whatever is going on in the country. And I think that that's when we're thinking of voter suppression, it's not just, making sure people are able to vote, but it's showing that these people are human, that they deserve to have a voice in the system that they're also impacted by. I think that's something that's really important too.
Yeah, definitely.
And I mean, unfortunately, voting rights is something that's been viewed increasingly as a partisan issue. But when you look at specifically felony disenfranchisement, I mean, there's evidence there to suggest that it goes way beyond political representation, that someone having their voting rights restored, it leads to a less likely chance that that person is going to go back into the criminal justice system. I mean, it goes beyond partisan politics. It's something about civic participation being linked to someone's civil rights and their own personal well-being.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we've talked a bit about like what voter suppression is and some communities that are most impacted. How are we as young people impacted by voter suppression?
So I think specifically as college students, I mean, we are really affected by, absentee voting and restrictions on voting in a state in which you may not originally be from. Just speaking from, the perspective of someone living in Tennessee, like myself, if I wanted to vote in Tennessee, I'm currently registered in Ohio. If I go to school in Tennessee, but if I'm originally from out of state, I have to get a Tennessee driver's license in order to vote in Tennessee. And my situation currently, I go to school out of state, but I'm from Tennessee. If I wanted to register and vote in Tennessee, I can't register for the first time at a voter registration drive or anything like that. I have to go to the Elections Commission office and register to vote in person there. That way I can show my Tennessee driver's license. That way they know that I'm a Tennessee resident. I mean, these are things that are preventing people from voting, specifically college students from voting, because I mean, no one is going to go and get their driver's license changed just so that they can vote. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation, and it's frankly inaccessible in so many ways. I mean, think of all of the different communities that don't drive. I mean, these are things that impact college students and young people at a disproportionate rate. And I mean, that's 100% the intention.
What you said specifically about how you need an in-state identification card to be able to vote within that state that you are currently residing in as a student, that sort of brings it back to this other state that I was looking at when I was doing research on voter suppression. New Hampshire has that same legislation on the books, but it's even increasingly a problem in New Hampshire because nearly 6 in 10 college students are out-of-state college students. So the individuals that are living in this place in New Hampshire for a majority of the year don't even get to have their voice heard in these democratic elections, which is insane, absolutely, because when you are living in a space, you should be able to have the right to have your voice heard, to make your community better, to fight for issues that you care about so deeply, for issues that affect you, frankly, like affordability of college, because states control tuition costs and how much money that universities are getting. Absolutely. So college students are impacted. You're correct. But I'm also curious how young people that aren't college students are impacted as well.
I'll say from my own experience, in high school, I didn't learn much about civics necessarily. I knew what voting was. I knew the 3 branches of government. I knew the typical things that you would learn, I guess, in an American high school. But I guess coming to college, I realized how important local elections were. I realized how important school board elections are, state, and of course, federal. I didn't learn any of that in high school. I got a few tastes of it when my high school was having a big conversation about what people could wear, and like primarily girls in school. And we talked to a lot of the school board members, and this was my senior year, so I don't know how much the rules have changed here. But it's really sad that in American school systems, at least from my city, in Suffolk, Virginia, that we learned the bare minimum for government. It took a lot to learn in college. I'm a senior now at George Mason, and it's taken me 3 years after graduating from high school to understand the importance of local, federal, state type of elections. And of course, the job that I do now, I do a lot more involved with my communities. So I think it's really hard for people coming from high school who might not pursue a higher education or might not be able to pursue a higher education, that they really don't know what's going on. They only know mostly about federal elections. And I see that a lot, again, reflecting on college students. As I registered a lot of college students at my school, a lot of them didn't know what was going on. It was a state election that we just had. And I had to explain to them the difference between state and federal. And these are kids coming from all parts of Virginia or all parts of the US. And it's a shame that something that really impacts our lives isn't taught as it should be in school.
So what you're saying is a way in which the state and our communities are sort of suppressing youth turnout or suppressing the vote of young people is by not properly funding civics programs or social studies programs or history programs to teach individuals about the history behind voting rights more in depth than it currently is.
And especially in these states with incredibly difficult processes to register to vote, not having that education and putting that burden on young people to, one, seek out the education on civic participation, but then also to put that responsibility on students to navigate these increasingly complex and difficult systems to get involved, makes it so much harder for young people to have their voices heard. And so many states don't offer same-day voter registration on the days of elections. Certain states, their voter registration deadline so far in advance that by the time an election rolls around and you start seeing ads on TV, it's already too late for you to register. And so I think that we're doing a real disservice to our young people by not educating our young people on, how to get involved and what this process really looks like.
So in DC, we have a really large homeless youth population, and an issue that we constantly see or are running into is that young people don't have their documents. They don't have birth certificates, social security cards. They don't have any of those things that they would need because of moving around, not having access to them, whatever the case may be. And those are important documents, and you need like to be able to register to vote, but then also you need to have an address that you can register to vote. And if you're someone who's couch surfing, because a lot of people don't consider that being homeless, but that is, if you're staying from friend to friend's house, that's not an address you can live in or that you're consistently living in, or things like that. That also impacts how a young person can show up. Because how are you able, if you're not taught the importance of voting and why you should vote and understanding the system that you need to navigate in order to vote, if you're just trying to survive to find your next meal and your next home, how are you going to be able to engage in civics in the way that folks want people to show up if you don't have your basic needs met?
I truly think that the system is set up in that way because our politicians and our structures are meant to oppress and suppress young people, low-income people, Black and brown individuals, anyone who basically is not a white cis individual. We have these systems that are putting people in a place where they can't participate in it. They can't effectively change it. And it's so frustrating from this perspective of someone who wants to change these systems, understanding that we have an increasingly complex, every single day it's increasingly getting more complex to ensure that individuals are engaged in these marginalized communities. So no matter what angle people are coming from, there's always roadblocks, it seems like, to registering to vote, to getting involved in elections, to getting involved in your basic civic duty. So something that I sort of wanted to talk about when Addison and I were coming up with these questions was not only talking about and really emphasizing how this is a structural issue, how this is something that it was made inherently like this to suppress individuals that are marginalized historically. However, I kind of wanted to talk about the power dynamic side of it and how it's not only a structural side, but it's a societal side as well. I was wondering if any of you have any additional comments on that or thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, so that really reminds me of gerrymandering, how politicians will basically cherry pick who they want in their districts and who they want to get their votes from. So I know a lot of legislation in Virginia has gone through to prevent gerrymandering happening. And historically, we could see things like that happening in low income neighborhoods that could be primarily, I'll say, for example, Black people. They would, of course, put in certain systems that you have to read on a certain level in order to vote, which is, the literacy laws they had not too long ago, actually. So it would prevent that certain group from voting. And then you have on the other side, you could have a higher income area and they would be able to vote. And that would definitely swing the vote towards somebody who wants the wealthier people to vote for them because they'll probably vote in a certain way. So I think the systems that we have today still reflect what we've had in the past. I know a lot of places still have very gerrymandered parts of their state that will obviously bring in a certain vote and have a certain outcome.
Yes, politicians are recreating these structures. When we redraw districts, and a lot of the times as state legislator, they are just creating districts that are going to help them win re-election rather than a sound district that represents the people and is in a group of people that live in a specific county or a set of counties or within like a certain landmass. Yeah, you're absolutely right that politicians through gerrymandering are recreating these structures day in and day out. And every 10 years, however many that a state constitution declares. Absolutely. Do any of you have any other thoughts on that?
I think mentioning gerrymandering is so important because that is such a big factor of this whole equation. One thing that I think I can say for kind of on the electoral side, the time that I spent in Iowa, I was in Waterloo, which is a city that I absolutely love. I fell in love with so many of the people in that community, but it is also one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so I was, every single day I would be organizing, knocking on people's doors, and there was a real sense of kind of disillusion with the political system, specifically within Iowa. I think, all of these candidates coming in every 4 years, knocking on doors, asking for a vote, and not paying any attention to the issues that are impacting those really living in those communities. And so I just remember this one conversation I had one day, probably back in October. I went on the street, knocking the packet, and this one man answered the door, and I asked him if he was planning on caucusing, and he said that he was not planning on it because he was really just tired of feeling powerless. He felt as though every single time he had tried to go vote and participate in caucusing, it had not gone the way that he had wanted it to. The organizers and the candidates that came into his community earlier and were, swearing up and down that they were there for that community specifically would leave the next day. And so he said he was not planning on caucusing. And the way that the caucus system works is that there are certain caucus locations that elect more delegates than others. And so, when you're on a campaign in Iowa, you're organizing in a specific area with a number of precincts, and those precincts are ranked based on how many delegates they assign. And so this particular neighborhood that I was in, predominantly Black neighborhood, had one of the precincts with the highest influence because they elected the most amount of delegates in that neighborhood. And so, that was the thing that I really emphasized to this man. Was I said, one, all of these barriers are being put in place to prevent you from voting because they know that if you went in and were able to exercise that power, you'd have a huge say in the way this election is going to go. As I was sitting there talking to him, he was, I think, on his way out to the store. So we were talking a little bit by his car as he was, waiting for his family to come out. And, people were just kind of walking down the street, crowding around us at one point, listening to the two of us talk back and forth about how much power this individual neighborhood, this one street, actually had. And so on the electoral side, I think that just one of the things that's so important that we as organizers do is really emphasize the collective strength that these communities have in terms of tackling these problems. These systems are really difficult to navigate, but when we do the work that we need to do to make sure that they have access to the ballot, to their caucus location, whatever it may be, and if we're doing that work to make sure that these people in their communities feel as though they can speak on behalf of themselves and that they can advocate for themselves and really cultivate their own power, that does wonders. And I just really saw it in that one community, the way that, things really shifted a little bit, I think, for me and I think for them, after that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think something that is interesting that you pointed out is how when a community comes together and starts to build an understanding, a mutual understanding about the power that voting has, it's a way in which we in our daily actions can help one another learn, and we can tear down the ideology and we can begin to tear down the structures that are trying to suppress the vote and suppress the voices of these communities. And that is a way that we can combat voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement in our own way too. Not only lobbying, calling legislators, but helping one another understand the importance of their votes. Because at the end of the day, these politicians in power do not want us to vote if we are not going to vote for them, which is so disgusting at the end of the day. So that is interesting that it's a way that we can combat voter suppression in our local communities and across the country by having those conversations. Absolutely. Do you think that politicians are recreating these structures and continuing these structures to exist by sort of not reaching out to communities that don't typically vote? Do you think that you see that within your time in electoral politics or in your time in politics in general?
I do, to a degree. I think that we have to really reframe the way that we think about different communities' value when it comes to the electoral picture. We can't look at these communities that don't traditionally turn out to vote and say they're not showing up because they don't want to. We have to really invest in these communities. And I think that one of the really important things is that we're not going into someone's community and telling them what they need and then expecting that to be enough. We have to go into these communities and ask, what do you need? How can we help you? And so, in my experience, so much of that was, how can I provide childcare on caucus night? I know this one woman who answered her door, she wanted the crack in her street outside of her house. She wanted that addressed. How can we give community members the tools that they need to do what they think is best for their communities and not what we see as being best for them. And so I think that we really do have to rethink, how are we investing in different communities and what do we see as the value in certain communities?
Going out into the certain communities that may not have a voice usually, you could see the things like lack of signs. So lack of signs for an election, actually. So I've noticed through my travels of the Nova area, when I would go out and do get out to vote or registering people, I would see more signs in wealthier neighborhoods or wealthier streets rather than going to neighborhoods that are probably low income or primarily minorities. I wouldn't see as many signs in those neighborhoods. And it's something so simple as that, as not even having some type of communication with them from the politicians to those people. And I think it's something so simple to do, to go put a sign out in a neighborhood. But at sometimes too, I would see people reach out and put cards or little pamphlets in people's doors. But again, that still would be lacking in neighborhoods that were mostly minorities and low income. And I know a lot of people too that I've talked to, it's like they didn't want to go out to vote because they didn't feel like they were being heard. And now it's someone like me, who I worked for a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization, someone like me having to explain to them why it's important that you go out and vote. And it's really saddening to see that over years, these people have been taught basically that, or not necessarily taught, they haven't felt like they've been heard. The example with the crack in the street, actually, I've had a couple people say, yeah, they wouldn't even listen to us wanting to get the road fixed. So why would they care now? And it's really sad seeing that something so simple as fixing a street is ignored. And I do feel like a lot of politicians don't reach out to those neighborhoods for whatever reason. And then I've also seen politicians who do want that vote. They know that that vote is really helpful for them, but they would still ignore it.
I think that boils down to, at least from what I've seen in a lot of work, the idea that politicians are only reaching out to communities that they know vote because at the end of the day, they're worried about their election. And to me, leadership looks like investing in those communities that you are representing and explaining to them that you have the power to vote. If you don't like what I'm saying, please vote me out. Or tell me what you need. I will listen to you. Give me a solution. I will bring it to you. Really, like, just sitting down and listening to communities at the end of the day. That is a way that politicians can actively start to challenge the systems that they're trying to work within. It's so frustrating that at the end of the day, understandably, politicians are worried about their election and getting reelected, but the system that they're recreating through these actions of only reaching out to predominantly white communities, to predominantly wealthy communities, high voter areas, it's impacting these communities in real ways because a lot of these communities are not being heard anymore because of that, or they have never been heard because of that.
So we've talked about different ways that people are impacted by voter suppression and the different types of power dynamics or structures that are in place that really disenfranchise folks. So thinking of all these things, what are policies or systems that can be used or brought attention to that will actively bring these people that are currently disenfranchised into the larger political landscape?
Thankfully, in Virginia, a lot of our politicians now have passed laws that have been disenfranchising people, especially minorities in this state, for a long time. One of them, for example, would be the voter ID laws in Virginia. So we've recently gotten rid of some of the requirements, which were like some type of state ID. You could use a university ID, things like that, or a work ID or something like that. And we're going to go back to the system where you could show a bill in your name, or you could do it via Social Security. And if you don't have any of those type of things, there's many other ways that you can verify it's you, but you could also sign an affidavit saying that that is you. And this is how it used to be in Virginia, I believe maybe 15 years ago, something along the lines of that. And I know that's held a lot of people back, again, like we talked about earlier, how people might not have IDs for X, Y, and Z. Another thing that we've had that has been a really big issue now is absentee voting. So in Virginia, we also passed a no excuse absentee voting. So now, instead of the 50 million reasons why you have to get an absentee ballot, you can just request one. I know that's a really big issue right now, being that we're in a pandemic and a lot of people are afraid to go to polling places. So I think that's something that's really going to help a lot of Virginians now, because I know for myself, I've used absentee ballots before from being in Northern Virginia to Southern Virginia. It wasn't that easy, I would say, because being up at George Mason, they wouldn't notify you if you got a letter in the mail. So you would have to be on it if you requested absentee ballot. And then I know a lot of other people who had requested one and never received it in the mail. But I think that having an excuse for an absentee ballot, it makes it harder. Now, if your excuse isn't provable or something like that, they won't let you get one. So I think it's really important now that our politicians are starting to take action and knowing that these previous laws have hurt our communities.
Absolutely. So you're saying ways in which we can sort of challenge this voter suppression is by actively calling for legislation like no reason absentee ballots, like getting rid of voter ID laws that are disproportionately infecting trans individuals, Black and Brown individuals, poor communities. Absolutely.
I mean, I can just speak about someone living in the state of Tennessee and in the Deep South. I think unfortunately here we're having to play a little bit of defense, and a lot of these laws are having to be fought in the courts. So recently, Tennessee passed legislation to effectively criminalize voter registration. So this was in response to a movement that was started by organizers and really, really great nonprofits on the ground here in Tennessee to mobilize and register Black voters in the lead up to the 2018 midterms. And the response to that was within our state legislature to pass a law that said that if you turn in a certain number of voter registration forms that are filled out incorrectly or incomplete, then you can face fines and potentially jail time. And so that's a law that's being fought out in the courts right now. But, I think that these are things that unfortunately for us are having to be fought out in the courts. With the Supreme Court case in 2013, Shelby County v. Holder, which struck down a section of the Voting Rights Act, which initially said that states with a historic track record of discriminating against certain populations when it came to voting, those states have to get their revisions to their voter laws approved by the federal government. The Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional, it's an overstep, it's an overreach in the state's rights. So there's no check and balance for many of these states. And so, since that decision is when we've really seen rollbacks on early voting and polling locations being closed down. There's no check and balance right now. And when I think of things that are being done currently that, are attempting to tackle this issue, I think of the Tennessee Black Voter Project that, did successfully register Black voters. I think of the ballot initiative in Florida that got passed in the 2018 midterms, restoring the right to vote to formerly incarcerated people after they had completed their parole. But that's also a law that's having to be fought out in the courts because there's now an attempt to attach to that. You have to pay back all of your fines and fees associated with that, which people are criticizing as being a poll tax. Tennessee has laws like that too, where if you want to get your right to vote restored, you have to pay any late child support payments that you have, even if that has nothing to do with the crime that you committed. And even if you accumulated child support debt while you were in jail, not able to have a job to pay that. These are things that are having to be fought out in the courts. And I think that we do have really, really great organizations and organizers on the ground here that are doing the work that we need in order to combat these things. But, unfortunately, for a lot of states, we just don't have the state legislatures that we need to really codify some of these changes.
Absolutely. So it's not only about passing legislation. If you're lucky enough to have a legislator that actually cares about voter rights, a lot of the times it's about battling these things in the courts. And if not in the courts, battling them during election time, battling them in the streets. You have to fight for what you know is right. And that means taking many different avenues to ensure that everyone has access to the ballot, to the polls, as well as to just basic registration. Absolutely. So we've sort of talked about ways to engage individuals, ways in which individuals are suppressed, ways to ensure that we're combating these issues. But I'm really curious, since Not My Generation is a gun violence prevention organization, how do you see this issue of voting rights tying back to the gun violence prevention movement, or even tying back to other movements that young people care so deeply about, like the climate justice movement?
Well, when I think of voting rights, and when I think of all of the different, important fights that we have to continue with, um, I really think voting rights is kind of at the foundation of all of these issues. Because if people are not able to express their voice and their opinions, then we're not able to vote out certain representatives, certain elected officials. We're not able to sort of see the change that we view as being necessary. I know I just mentioned the Tennessee Black Voter Project, but in that same election, Tennessee elected our Senator Marsha Blackburn to the Senate, and the NRA donated over $1 million to that campaign. So I think that when it comes to gun violence prevention being tied to voting rights, I mean, we have to make sure that people are able to have their voices heard if we want to see the change, and if we want to see that change be implemented, when it comes to legislation.
Absolutely, 110%. Getting back to the idea of how at the core of a lot of the work that the gun violence prevention movement has to do with electoral politics. And because certain states have strict voter ID laws, they have certain legislation that is suppressing the vote, we're not able to vote out these politicians that are NRA backed. We're not able to vote out these politicians that are not taking gun violence prevention seriously. Absolutely.
So I think a lot of the on the ground work will help people understand that in order to get things changed, basically, like we said earlier, like in order to get things changed, we have to go out there and do it. Being that the NRA headquarters is in good old Fairfax, Virginia, where I do most of my canvassing type of work, I think surprisingly in the communities that we've reached out to, which are typically, like I've said earlier, marginalized groups, a lot of them are actually against the NRA or for a lot of gun law changes. I'm going to take it a little personal. So I'm originally from Suffolk, Virginia, which is about 30 minutes away from Virginia Beach. And almost a year ago in 6 days, we had a mass shooting. It really hits home because during that time, I have family members who work over there or who worked in law enforcement and didn't hear from them. So it was terrifying. So going back to being in Northern Virginia, where the people who are in the pockets of these politicians, it's hard seeing a lot of the politicians that you advocated for do not make changes. So, for example, I'm going to give a good old shout out to Chap Peterson, the man that voted against a lot of gun reform laws in this past few sessions when he got reelected, I believe. And it really hurts knowing that the people that you advocated for doesn't really care for us. So I've personally put my time and donations as well into people who have been fighting these NRA-loving politicians. So someone who sadly lost from the state elections in Virginia Beach, she advocated for a lot of gun reform. And I saw from her movement, a lot of people in that area, in the Virginia Beach area, have had a little bit of a change in mindset. So seeing that we've had several mass shootings in this state, including Virginia Tech, and now the shooting that we had almost a year ago, I think that really has shaken a lot of people in saying that these politicians need to listen to us. And I know they're also scared because back to Chap Peterson, he was teetering back and forth whether to vote for something or not. And at first he was like, yeah, I'm going to support gun laws, but then he changed his mind. So and I think these type of things do scare them. We scare them. So going back to empowering voters, to let them know that we have that power to scare them and to make them vote in the way that their constituents want, it helps us feel better. And of course, it's a good story to tell others to how they can feel empowered. So that could be an example for them. And if they want something else to change, like healthcare, they can scare these politicians who are taking money from these big corporations who are fighting against some type of healthcare reform. So,
yeah. So hearing what both of you are saying about again, the core of it. It's about voter rights and who has access to the ballot. And the legislation that is being put through is because individuals who come from a more privileged background actually have the capacity to vote and the ability to vote. So at the end of the day, the gun violence prevention movement is so deeply connected to voter rights because those that are disproportionately affected by voter ID laws, by lack of polling locations, by the multitude of other ways in which our systems oppress voter turnout in voter registration, those tend to be individuals that care about issues like gun violence prevention, that care about issues like affordable healthcare, affordable education, the climate justice movement. If we're not fixing these issues of voter disenfranchisement, then those things are never going to be solved. So I think that's an important message for our listeners, the people in the gun violence prevention movement to really take home and take to heart. At the end of the day, we have to start caring more about voting rights, ensuring that everyone has access to the ballot, unless nothing is going to change for the gun violence prevention movement.
I wanted to thank you both for taking the time to speak with us about this important topic. I think a lot of our conversation, I really hope folks really get understanding the connections of voter suppression and gun violence prevention movement that Elijah beautifully tied together. It like brings them back. They're able to come back from this conversation, really understanding more about how these different movements really intersect and aren't necessarily so disconnected from each other as we may think so. So we hope to have you all back on soon for the podcast. It was really a pleasure to meet both of you and talk to you about this topic.
Yeah, it's been fun. Yeah, thank you.
Again, like Addison said, thank you so much for coming on today. Before we leave everyone, we did want to give some information. So for our listeners, we wanted to give some resources. If your vote is being suppressed, or if you believe that you are being turned away at the polls for a nonsensical reason, please call the Voter Suppression Hotline by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law at 866 Our Vote. Again, that is 866 OURVOTE. And if you are Spanish speaking, we will make sure to include that in the comments as well as in the transcript of this podcast.
Thank you for listening to episode 10 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast, where we discussed voter suppression and how gun violence is political with Henry Hicks and Monét Ballard.
In solidarity, Elijah Nichols,
Addison Moore,
Henry Hicks,
And Monét Ballard.